Hello, this is a video on the philosophy of language. It's part of my Lectures on Philosophy series, and if you look in the description on YouTube, you'll find a link to where that whole series can be found. But this one is on the philosophy of language, sometimes called hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the science of interpretation. From a philosophical standpoint, hermeneutics is the question of how do we get from, say, a text to a meaning, or how do we get from the world to a meaning for that matter? Because there's a sense in which the whole world, all the world's a text, and all of us interpreters of the world. And so how do we get from a sign to a signified, slightly using the words wrong there, but how do we get to meaning from speech, from written words, from smoke signals? The whole idea of getting from signs to meaning is called semiotics. Some of you may have heard that word. Well, okay. How does language work? That's what this video is about. Well, in the previous video, which was Perspectives on Truth, I talked about the fact that we are all, to some extent or another, pre-reflective or unreflective thinkers. That is to say, we don't know what we don't know. And it's frustrating. Let me give you a personal example. So for a very, very long time, I read Matthew 5 in a particular way at the verse where it says, God causes it to rain on both the righteous and the unrighteous. God causes it to rain on both the righteous and the unrighteous. Now, in my dictionary, as a kid growing up, rain was not a positive thing. Rain, rain, go away, please come back another day. And so in my dictionary, the dictionary I grew up with, rain, bad. And so when I read that verse for years and years and years and years and years, I read it to say God causes it to rain. He allows bad things on both the righteous and the unrighteous. So I took the verse to mean God allows bad things to happen to good people, which of course is true, but that's not what the verse means. At some point, and I hate to tell you how late it was in my life that dawned on me, that in an agrarian society or in a farming world, ancient Israel was a farming world, right? Galilee, rain is a very good thing. If you're a farmer, now you can get too much rain, but most of the time, if you live in a dry climate like Israel, rain is a good thing. And so it's like, how could I be so stupid? This verse is saying exactly the opposite of what I thought it was saying. Rain is good. And so it's saying that God gives good things even to bad people. And then I read the paragraph. I mean, it's completely obvious from the paragraph. It says, you've heard it said, love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. But I say, do good to those who hate you. Doesn't God send rain, not just on the righteous people, but on the unrighteous people as well? Therefore, be complete like your heavenly Father is complete. Obvious. But I didn't know. I was unreflective. It didn't even occur to me to ask, is rain good or bad here? And this is the way we are, unfortunately. We don't know what we don't know. We are all, to some extent or another, unreflective in our reading of the world. We don't know we have glasses on. And so we shove meaning onto the world. We shove meaning onto the biblical text. There's a reason why there are thousands and thousands of different denominations. And it's not because, well, there's only one group that is truly righteous and has it right, and everybody else is evil. No, it's because a text is by its very nature, there's a word for it, polyvalent. And the word polyvalent means susceptible to multiple interpretations. And therefore, it's quite possible for one person to see one meaning and another person to see another. The way I've sometimes described it is, a Baptist comes to the Bible with a Baptist dictionary, and of course the Bible teaches Baptist things. Or a Methodist comes to the Bible with a Methodist dictionary, and of course the Bible teaches Methodist things. Or a Catholic, or a Lutheran, or Jehovah's Witness. Jehovah's Witnesses is sometimes, no offense, sometimes considered a cult because it doesn't have a full view of Jesus' divinity, as I understand it. And yet, Jehovah's Witnesses believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, that Scripture has no error in it. And yet, what they believe it says is quite different from what most people throughout church history have believed the Bible says. It says. And the fact of the matter is we all grow up with a certain dictionary. Maybe we go to church and we get a certain dictionary from church, and we just assume that that's what the Bible teaches. But does the Bible actually teach it? When I used to teach New Testament survey, I would have students write a position paper. But I always made it clear, make sure that your issue is actually mentioned in the New Testament. Because I would have students, for example, a student might want to write a position paper on divorce, not divorce, on abortion, let's say. But abortion isn't mentioned in the New Testament. I'm not saying that the New Testament doesn't have something to contribute to that debate. I'm simply saying you're going to have to be really, really sophisticated to come up with an argument against abortion from the New Testament, because it's not even mentioned. And yet, why is it that there's this assumption? Well, of course, I have the New Testament position on abortion. Well, what verse are you looking at? Do you see what I'm saying? We see things that are in our head and not necessarily in the text itself. And so the goal is of biblical interpretation for us to become reflective readers of the Bible. In our default state, we may not realize that we're even doing interpreting. I had a family member once, I was talking about, well, in the Wesleyan tradition, we do this. In the Wesleyan tradition, we do this. And at one point, my family member got a little annoyed and frustrated and stopped and said, stop saying Wesleyan tradition. We just read the Bible and do what it says. Well, again, that's an unreflective reader that doesn't realize that they're wearing Wesleyan glasses when they read the biblical text. And so this is often the case that people will say, well, I'm standing on the Bible, but does the Bible actually say anything? I've heard this in relation to recently with regard to Black Lives Matter. Well, I have the biblical perspective on Black Lives Matter. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, what's the biblical perspective on Black Lives Matter? Well, I suppose that Black Lives Matter, but that's not the position they were talking about. They were actually against Black Lives Matter and were saying, I have the biblical. I mean, what were they talking about? I don't even know what verses they were thinking of. So my point is that we all see things in the Bible that are a matter of our head more than they are of the Bible itself. And let me just briefly mention Lectio Divina. I am not against Lectio Divina. Lectio Divina is where you kind of read the text and you read the biblical text, you read it over and you kind of chew on it and you let it cogitate and you let the Holy Spirit speak to you through the text. I don't have a problem with that. But let me tell you this, since the Bible was written to people who lived 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, before English even existed as a language, in the ancient Near East for the Old Testament, in the various contexts of the ancient Near East in the Old Testament, and in the Greco-Roman world in the New Testament, and various different contexts in the Greco-Roman world in the New Testament. If you don't know something about ancient culture, you are not going to come up with the actual meaning of the Bible by using Lectio Divina. The Holy Spirit may speak to you, absolutely. The Holy Spirit meets us where we are. God comes to us, and so I believe in Lectio Divina. In fact, I'm gonna refer to something called reader response criticism in a moment. Lectio Divina is a form of reader response criticism where I use my dictionary that I have, and I read the words of the text in the light of the meanings in my head. But I can tell you, the Holy Spirit is not going to input ancient meanings into your head while you're doing Lectio Divina. Now, if you're an Old Testament scholar and you're doing Lectio Divina and you already have those meanings in your head, of course, then maybe God will piggyback on your sense of the original meaning. But let's say you know nothing about the history or the original meaning of the Bible and you do Lectio Divina, God may very well speak to you, but it's not going to be what the Bible actually meant, because it's not up here for God to use. Again, these are claims that this video will unfold and unpack as we go through it. Our default pre-reflective reading of the Bible is probably going to assume that the Bible is one book. I mean, look at it. It's bound as one book, and that God wrote it, and he wrote it to me. Now, I may not express it that narcissistically. I may say, well, it was for all people in all time. But as we're going to see in a second, because it's my head that's interpreting the words, and because it's my dictionary that's interpreting the words. When I say it was written for all times and all places, what I'm really saying is it was written according to the dictionary in my head. It was written to me. And that's just what's going to that's what's going to happen. I'm not going to know the meaning it had, 2,000 years ago when I view it that way. And of course, it's not just one book. If you're a Protestant, it's 66 books. If you're a Roman Catholic or Greek Orthodox, it's even more than 66 books. These books were written over 1,000 years by multiple different authors to address multiple different situations. And so they have these tensions because of these different situations, because what works in one situation is not what works in another situation. And so when you take two texts written for contrasting situations, they're going to contrast with each other. And so Paul says, we are justified by faith and not by works of law. And James says we are justified by works and not by faith alone. Books written to different contexts, they sound like they don't agree with each other. And let me also say that there can be sophisticated analyses that we might call a biblical worldview or a biblical theology. There can be sophisticated versions of that. But when I hear someone say, I have a biblical worldview, or we need to study this from the biblical worldview, my first thought is, you don't know how to read the Bible in context, probably, because most of those who use this are talking about a monolithic, uniform perspective that has more to do with something that they have imposed on the biblical text than on the hard work of reading each book in its individual context, in its individual meaning, and connecting it together. So usually when people talk about a biblical worldview, they're talking about a non-contextual reading of the Bible. When you get into biblical theology, you begin to talk about a Matthean theology and a Lucan theology and a Pauline theology and a Johannine theology and an Isianic theology and a Deuteronomistic theology and a psalmist, theology of the Psalms and so forth. And so when you really get into the scholarship of reading these books in context, their particularity becomes more and more clear. And in fact, and again, I do believe that an Old Testament theology can be done. I do believe that. However, there are many scholars who say just can't do it. The theologies of the Old Testament are too diverse to have a single Old Testament theology. I think it can be done, but my point in this slide is to indicate that we are, whether we like it or not, to one degree or another, unreflective or pre-reflective in our reading of pretty much any text. And so there has to be this dialogue between us and a text, sometimes called a hermeneutical spiral, where we go back and forth, me the text, and as it spirals, we get closer to a kind of agreement between us and the text. The text changes us, we go to the text and back and forth. But our default is to shove our glasses onto a text, and I'm especially talking about the biblical text, because this is a Christian philosophy series. But okay, bottom line is that context is everything. Words do not have fixed meanings apart from a context. A word, well, for one thing, a word is in a particular language. That puts it in a particular context, broadly speaking. But even within a particular language, we have to ask, okay, well, when was this word used? Because the use of words in the 1600s is different from the use of English words in the 21st century. So even there are people who use the King James Version today. The first King James Version was in 1611. It had about 5 revisions before the version that is now used from the late 1780s, I think, the current revision. And so there are words that meant something different in 1600 than they mean today. For example, the original King James, I think, mentioned that Paul, something about Paul's carriage. Carriage is what it meant, things he was carrying. Even that is an image from suitcases in our world, because Paul didn't have suitcases. But even by the 1780 something version of the King James, it didn't say carriage anymore because it meant something different. A carriage was, like a horse with carriages. And so that's another context. What English are we talking about? Are we talking about English of the 1600s, 1700s, or 2100s, or 2000s? Sorry, we haven't got to 2100s. But so that's a broad context. But even if you're talking about 2020 New York, where I'm at right now, English, you have to have a context to know exactly what the word is meaning in a particular sentence. Context, words are at best ambiguous until they have a context to help us know exactly what they mean. Context is everything. Words do not have a meaning in a bubble. Words, because as soon as my brain goes to the bubble, I'm going to impose my context upon the words. And so if you want to know what words mean, you must know the context of those words. Okay, well, so for probably from about the 400s, and maybe even before then, till the early 20th century, the assumption of meaning of words was largely on the basis of what a fellow by the name of Ludwig Wittgenstein called the picture theory of language. So the picture theory of language is basically the idea that a word corresponds to a thing. I say word, you picture a thing. So I say pencil, you picture a pencil. This works to some extent because if I'm talking about a book, you might picture a book. It's a very noun-oriented view of language, as we'll see in a second. But another way of viewing it is words can correspond to ideas, which are also nouns, right? A noun is a person, place, or thing, or idea. And so, I could talk about Marxism. There's an idea. My word corresponds to an idea. So this is kind of a fairly simplistic view of language that often works. I think one of the best expressions of this kind of perspective was given by Gottlob Frege, who lived in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Unfortunately, I found out that he was very sympathetic to Nazism, which is a reminder that you can be very smart and be very immoral. He saw himself as righteous, of course, but anyway, and it's a warning to us all, of course, because we all look at these moments in history and we think, well, if I'd have been there, I'd have known that Hitler was a bad guy. Well, there are an awful lot of people who I think would have followed Hitler, if the situation, if they were transposed into the same situation, they would be followers of Hitler. There were people who didn't like Hitler in Germany. Some of them were put to death and put in concentration camps. Anyway, just because you're a smart person like Frege doesn't mean that you're a good person, as it turns out. But anyway, Frege suggested that words have a sense and words have a reference. This works again sometimes. So the sense of pencil is a writing with some, or a utensil of writing, usually with some form of lead or lead substitute, made out of wood often, although not always. Sometimes it's hard for us to come up with a good definition of what the sense of a word is. But we know what the reference of a pencil is. Here's a nice little reference. So a sense is like what the word means as a word, and reference is what it points to in the real world. And of course, this is not entirely false, because we use language to describe the world, don't we? We use language to get around in the world, to communicate within the world, and so forth. So Frege is I don't want to throw Frege entirely out. Words often do have a clear reference, and so I thought I'd throw this in here because I couldn't think of a better place in this lecture to throw it in. But you might say that words can have this is related, but it's not exactly the same, or analogous, but not exactly the same. Words can have a denotation, what the word means, and then words can have a connotation, which are the implications of the word, or the feel of the word, or the flavor of the word, as it were. Let me give you an example. So I lived for 3 years in Durham, England, while I was doing my doctorate. Of course, there's some words that England, and gestures too, that England uses that aren't familiar to most people in the United States, for example. And so a word that I came across my first semester in England was the word knackered. I'd never heard this word before, and I inferred from the context of having heard it several times that it had something to do with being exhausted or being tired. And so I'd gone to an evening worship service at St. John's College, and we were doing polite talk afterwards. And a particular woman was talking to me, and she said, "Well, how are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, I'm fine, just a little bit knackered." My first time ever using the word, and she kind of smiled, and I didn't think anything of it. Well, a little bit later on, I can't remember whether it was that night or maybe the next day, her husband said, "So I hear you told my wife that you were a bit knackered." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "You realize, of course, that the word knackered has the connotation of being tired from having too much sex." And I did not know that. Well, as it turns out, I think he may not have known. He didn't seem to know this either. But it kind of depends on what part of England you're from, I think, because there were plenty of British people who used the word knackered exactly as I had used it. But apparently, I don't know where he was from in England, or maybe he just, maybe he and his wife, I don't know. But anyway, wherever he was from in England, it had a particular connotation that it didn't have in other places. So the denotation of being tired was the same, but the connotation of it was different. And so this is a distinction, again, that applies to language that it seems to me needed to be somewhere in this lecture. So, okay, but everything on this slide only goes so far. That there is a more precise understanding of how meaning works that Wittgenstein himself, the gentleman I just mentioned, devolved or developed, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But before I get to Wittgenstein, I want to mention a couple other people in this kind of early turn of the century, fin de siècle, end of the century, beginning of the 20th century people who are significant figures in the development of hermeneutics. The first one I want to mention is Ferdinand De Susu. And his book, Course in General Linguistics, was published after he died posthumously in 1916. And it was Saussure who said that a sign consists of two features. So a sign is, on the one hand, some sort of signifier. This could be a letter on a writing. It could be smoke for smoke signals. It could be beep, 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 beep. It could be sounds for Morse code. It could be baseball, which means steel home, whatever. But there's going to be some signifier, some symbol or action or something that has a meaning in a context. The signified is what that meaning is. And what De Saussure suggested is that the relationship between signifier and signified is not, it's arbitrary. Now, we can come up with a few exceptions where it isn't arbitrary. So the first thing that comes to mind is what we call onomatopoeia, where the word kind of sounds like what it refers to, like crash. To me, kind of sounds like something crashing, or could at least. But basically, De Saussure pointed out that there is an arbitrary relationship between the signifier and the signified. And I think this is a significant insight to have, because as we are pre-reflective, before we reflect on things, we might assume that the meaning of things is self-evident. But what De Susu indicates here is that the meaning of actions is not at all self-evident in the vast majority of times. And let me dive a little bit into ethics here. And again, you're welcome to disagree with me, because of course these philosophers all disagreed with each other a little bit on some things, and I'm not going to agree with them on everything. So certainly you can disagree with me, because I'm just little old Ken. But let's think about. Okay, here's a story. I actually don't know if this story happened, but it's a hilarious story to me. Maybe it's also an indication of my warped mind. So I heard a story about, I think it was Eisenhower, General Eisenhower at that point during World War II, was in North Africa. And he was going to be driving through a particular place where the indigenous women did not wear much clothing. And so Eisenhower, they were preparing the people for Eisenhower, and they suggested to the women that they should cover their breasts, because it would be offensive to Eisenhower for their breasts to be showing. And so, again, I don't know if this is true or not, but allegedly, as Eisenhower drove past these women, they all lifted up their skirts to cover their breasts, leaving, of course, their bottom half completely exposed. Well, what this story tells me is that there was no intrinsic meaning to these body parts, or at least to their breasts, that their breasts didn't have, well, it actually would suggest more about the bottom half, but I'm basically arguing that the significance of a bare-breasted woman was apparently different in Africa, at that whatever location that was, than it would be in New York, where I live. There is, in other words, there is not a intrinsic meaning to breasts everywhere in the world. Now, I realize maybe this is a bad example, but at least it keeps you interested, right? Keeps you watching the video. There is no necessary meaning to most things. And of course, we assume that things have a meaning. Well, of course that meant this, but it may not mean that to somebody else. It certainly may not mean that to someone in a different culture. And of course, this is how words, how wars can start. You know, where one side says, "Well, you meant this," and the other side says, "I didn't mean that," and then you fight over the meaning of various things. Anyway, De Susu was the first one who pointed out that the relationship between a signifier and what it signifies is not in any way an obvious thing. It's an arbitrary thing most of the time. De Susu also made the distinction between what he called parole, which is the speech that we hear and use. You're listening to my parole right now, and what he called langue. Langue for De Susu was the system in which parole exists. Now, if you saw my video on perspectives of truth, this strikes me a little bit of what I've called the Platonic fallacy. We can construct a langue, no doubt. We can do it. We can construct the langue of a language, the interrelationships between words, to some extent, although Wittgenstein's going to pull the rug out from under De Susu on this as well. But nobody has it, okay? We don't sit around, okay, it's time for you to learn the langue. In fact, my stepdaughters, when they were young, went to a Christian elementary school for a year and a half. And while they were there, one of the teachers had them learning phonemes. A phoneme is a little bit of sound. And I was just flabbergasted that this teacher thought that the best way to learn the meaning of things was to learn the little bits of a word and then to put them together. Now, I'm not saying that there are parts of words that are worth learning, like ness or tion. I mean, there are some of those things, but that's not the way we learn a language. We learn a language by picking it up. We speak it, we hear it, and we begin to we subconsciously learn the patterns. We don't think it all through. We don't memorize a chart of the long of a language, and now I've got it. In fact, occasionally I've had interactions with people from other cultures where their English is really abysmal, and I'm not faulting them. Learning another language is hard, but in retrospect, it's clear that the way they learned the language was by learning grammar. And although if you're trying to learn a dead language very quickly, that works. I mean, that's the way we learn Greek and Hebrew, ancient Hebrew and Latin and things like that, because we don't have 5 years to speak it to each other. And so learning it grammatically helps compress the learning. But if you're trying to learn a language of a place that you're going to go and live, you need to be involved in speech. I was talking to my daughter just today, my youngest daughter, about the use of lo and le in Spanish. I don't have it quite down. And I basically said to her, what we really need to do is we need to live somewhere where they speak Spanish, so the use of lo and le and all that stuff just kind of sticks in our subconscious. Same thing I've said to my son, who is taking German, that to figure out which prepositions, go with which, to do which English expressions. We just really need to be around people who say German, so we get these patterns in mind. So I think De Susu was a little bit too organized, as it were, when he said, basically, we can take the speech we actually use and analyze it in terms of the overall structure of the language. And of course, he's perhaps the father of structuralism, which was a fad of linguistics, especially in the 70s, it seems to me, but it didn't live very long. But part of De Susu's sense of the meaning of words is that we find the meaning of words in distinction from other words. There's some truth to that we find the meaning of words in distinction. Well, this is this and not that. I do think there's a lot of truth to that. Occasionally, I've had conversations with people who've said, Ken, you need to stop contrasting, say, the Wesleyans with other denominations. You need to talk about what we believe positively, not what we don't believe. Well, the problem with this, again, I'm very patient with people, is that to the extent that De Susu is correct, you can't know what a Wesleyan is without knowing what a Wesleyan isn't, because words don't have meanings in what they are. Words have meanings in what they're not. Anyway, so isn't this fun? This is the philosophy of language. This is hermeneutics. Roman Jacobson, I'll just mention this, was influenced by De Susu, and he came up with this sense of how communication happens. So we have a little bit of communication theory here. The sender is the person speaking. The receiver is the person receiving the message. We have the message, which is the words or the signs themselves. We have the context, which I've mentioned. Channel and code are, code has to do with, these are two types of language. So like the code of a language could be talking about a language, or the channel of a language could be kind of signal words like, oh my, or that sort of thing. Basically, Jacobson said any speech we do is going to lean toward one or the other of these elements in the communication. I just wanted to mention Roman Jacobson because he's part of this whole history of hermeneutics. Okay, now back to Wittgenstein. This slide is the slide most important in this video, in my opinion, because Wittgenstein is the one who I think really best captured the way that language actually works. Now, Wittgenstein originally believed in the sign theory of language. In fact, sometimes with philosophers, we talk about the early Wittgenstein, the late Wittgenstein. That's the case with Wittgenstein. The early Wittgenstein wrote, it's a very famous piece called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophus, something like that, Philosophus. It had some good points. It's probably its most important point to me is its fifth point, which is whereof we cannot speak, we must be silent. He basically said there's a lot of things we talk about that we really can't say anything about. But anyway, Wittgenstein thought that he'd solved all the problems of philosophy, wanted to go work in a factory in communist Russia. Then he had a friend. He had a friend who said, "Hey, Wittgenstein, picture this," and gave him the Italian finger, which I guess I just gave you the Italian finger. I'm sorry if you're Italian, but you didn't know it. It's another indication of the fact that the signifier and the signified have a completely arbitrary connection. Chances are you had no idea what I was just doing to you, and it had no connotation whatsoever. In fact, probably didn't have any denotation to you either. It had neither a meaning nor a feel or a flavor to it because you didn't know what it was. And again, when we come to these sorts of things pre-reflectively, we assume that the meaning is automatic, but it's not. So in England, this is the peace sign, but if I were to turn it around, I would be giving you kind of the British version of the finger. And of course, we know the finger in the US has given many things to the world, and this is one of them, the finger. We've given it to the world. But these gestures with our hands do not have intrinsic meaning. The finger has no has no intrinsic meaning. Let me tell a story on my son. My son, I forget what grade, third, fourth grade. He should have known better. I believe that he was completely innocent, which shows how holy his home life was. But he had a classmate who said, "I can't get my middle finger to go up. I can't get it to go up." And my son said, "Well, I can get mine to go up," and basically gave the finger to the entire fourth grade, third grade class, whatever it was, fourth grade probably. And so to my son, that act had no meaning. And again, this is very important because when we read the Bible, we may assume that things that they do in the Bible had an obvious meaning. Judah sleeps with his stepdaughter Tamar, thinking that she's a prostitute. What was he thinking? He should have known. Or we assume, I often have heard sermons about how Abraham didn't trust God and slept with Hagar instead of waiting on God to bring him a son through Sarah. Well, in my opinion, that whole line of thinking doesn't know the practices of the ancient Near East. It was completely normal practice for a wife who was not bearing child to offer one of her servant girls, maidens, to bear seed for her. It was still considered her seed. It was still considered her child, even though it was a slave girl that gave birth to it. And so we probably are wrong if we read some sort of a lack of faith on Abraham's part into this story. What I'm getting at is the meaning of actions, like De Susu suggested, is arbitrary. It only means something if, in our context, it means something. And so Wittgenstein, when his friend gave him the Italian, whatever it is, whatever you want to call it, he said, "You know what? I can't think of a picture like a pencil. I can't think of a pencil that, I can picture the act, but I can't think of a meaning that the word or that gesture corresponds to." And when you think about it, like what is the picture that the word is corresponds to, or for that matter, righteousness? We can picture someone doing something righteous, but the word righteousness is abstract. And Wittgenstein, he was a rather bizarre person. You know, he had a real kind of whoa moment over this, and went back to the drawing board, no pun intended. And by the time he was done, he comes to the conclusion that the meaning of words is how they're used. They don't have actually a meaning in themselves. I had a ninth grade English teacher. She was a lovely English teacher, and I learned an awful lot from her, Mrs. Goss. But Mrs. Goss taught us that you don't know what a word means if you can't give a definition for it. And you know, I don't agree with her at all now. Wittgenstein doesn't agree with her. I would say that if you can use a word correctly in a sentence, then you know how to use that word correctly, and the meaning of a word is in how it's used. Definitions that we provide for words are abstractions. They're made up, as it were. They're attempts to capture the use of a word in a context. And in a sense, a dictionary entry is a popularity context. Meaning number one in a dictionary, and the number one way this word is used is the number two way, but the word doesn't have a meaning inside of it. A word doesn't have a intrinsic denotation. The meanings of words are catalogs of how they're used. And these meanings come into existence and they go out of existence. I mentioned carriage. Nobody in the United States that I know of talks about bring your carriage up to the room. Nobody would ever say that. That meaning of the word carriage is no longer used in American English. And by the same token, new words are constantly coming into existence, and new meanings to words. The word Google, 25 years ago, the word Google did not mean, you know, a internet search. And so we have this constant invention of words and what they mean, and we have new meanings that are added on to words. I'm just this first one that popped in my head when Michael Jackson said, I'm bad, you know it. I mean, he's using the word bad to mean good. Let me just say, it didn't always have that option of a meaning. So Wittgenstein basically his philosophy indicates that words do not actually have meanings in themselves. Words have uses, and those uses may be different from one another. And I often use the example of the word fire. There are lots of different ways the word fire can be used. Of course, if you want to take the picture theory of language, I say fire, you picture red stuff, right? But imagine these. You're fired. Where is the fire? Where's the literal fire in that use of it? Ready, aim, fire. Now we can figure out where that meaning came from. Oh, it's because they had a gunpowder and there's an explosion, there's fire. Yeah, but nobody thinks that when they fire a gun. Fire your gun. They don't think, oh, red stuff. It took me a long time to actually picture a goose in the expression a wild goose chase. I don't know when I realized this. For the first 30 years of my life, I never once pictured a goose, as far as I know, when I said the phrase wild goose chase. And if there's one person in the world that doesn't picture it, then the picture is not intrinsic to its meaning. And so the meaning of a word is in how it is used. Here's how Wittgenstein put it, that we play these games with words. And these games are shaped by certain forms of life or context, right? And so one of the meanings of the word fire is if I were to yell, fire, I'm not saying, oh, Ken's telling us that there's some red stuff somewhere in the building. What I'm really saying when I yell fire is get out of the building or you're going to die. There's an emotive, connotation to that. And so there are different language games with different forms of life. And in fact, some of comedy is where we take words from one situation and we apply them, to another kind of situation. Well, okay, again, I'm sorry, I have a warped mind. This is what popped into my mind. Playing doctor. You know, so you can have a doctor and a nurse in a operating room, or you can play doctor, you know, which is something quite different. Okay, here's a quote from this later work of Wittgenstein. He said, "If a lion could speak, would we understand it?" And what he means is we might be able to get out our dictionary and say, okay, the lion said the antelope is in the grass. And we might think, oh, isn't that lovely? He's sightseeing, you know. But who knows what that means? The antelope's in the grass could mean the enemy lion isn't paying attention. We don't know. In order to know what the words of a lion's speech would be, we would have to know the form of life of a lion. And at this point, when I've taught, I've often told the story at the Battle of the Bulge in World War II, where the Allied troops were surrounded and running out of ammunition. In fact, I think they'd run out of ammunition. And the Germans who had surrounded them at the Battle of the Bulge demanded their surrender. And the message that the U.S. leaders sent back was nuts. Well, the Germans could look up nuts. Nuts, yes, Nutte, you know. And I mean, they could define the word nut, but they didn't know the form of life in which nuts means, well, it means forget it in this particular case, with a little bit of attitude. So there is no meaning in a word. We only know the meaning of a word when we know the use and the context of that particular word. Context, as I just said, is everything. Now, there's some word fallacies, and I think these word fallacies follow upon Wittgenstein's fundamental understanding of how language works. And so it wreaks havoc with a lot of what people have fun with the Bible. This is like stuff preachers say this stuff all the time, and it's based upon a faulty understanding of how language works. It's fun, but it really isn't true. But so, for example, the lexical fallacy. The lexical fallacy is the idea that there is some core meaning to a word that follows that word around everywhere it's used. Well, I just gave you the example of "you're fired," which does not, for anybody, conjure the image of red stuff. And so now, again, you could find out where it branched off, you know, where it came from. But there is no essential denotation that a word has that is always in play every time the word is used. So if you hear a pastor say, now this word means, and they're not talking about a context, it's all for fun. There is no core meaning of a word that plays itself out every time a word is used. Even still worse is where a person will say, well, this word only means this every time. I heard someone came to me in my office, 15, 20 years ago and said, I've got this new Bible. It's called the One, I forget what it was called, One Meaning Bible or something like that. It always translates the Greek word the same way. What do you think about it? Here, look at it. And I said, I don't have to look at it. It's a horrible translation because words don't have just one meaning. And words in one meaning don't have the same overlay in another language. And so any translation that says we always translate a Greek word the same way, it's just going to be a bad translation. Just don't buy it unless you want to have fun with it. Words don't have just one meaning. Here's a very common one, the etymological fallacy. The etymological fallacy acts as if the history of the meaning of a word is in the meaning of that word. Now, sometimes it is. There are words that carry with them some of the fumes of the past, but that's a function of context. It's not a function of the word itself. Words in and of themselves do not have intrinsic meanings. And so sometimes people will say, now the word for sin, hamartia, means to miss the mark. And they might say it was used in archery where you missed a target or something like that. It doesn't matter how the word was used 400 years earlier or 800 years earlier. In the same way that the way that George Washington used words may have nothing to do with really with the way that I use English words today. The history of the meaning of a word does not have any essential connection with what a word means today. There was a famous theological dictionary produced in Germany called Kittel's Theological Dictionary. Unfortunately, Kittel was a horrible Nazi. But anyway, even despite that, another example of a very smart person who has a flawed and evil heart. But Kittel's Theological Dictionary is riddled with the etymological fallacy and the lexical fallacy. I find some value in it. I asked for it for Christmas, once upon a time. I have it still here in the house. But the problem is that some languages pay more attention to etymology than others. So the German language pays a lot of attention to how you add words together. So like the word for speed limit is Geschwindigkeitsbegrenzung. It's speed, Geschwindigkeit, and it's limit, Begrenzung, and you glue it together. And so the German language does pay more attention to the etymology or the parts, the history, breaking a word apart. German does that. I would say my guess is that Asian languages tend to see symbolic meanings in words more than say English does. But if there's one language that doesn't pay attention to etymology, or that doesn't pay attention to kind of the symbolism of a symbolic meaning of a word, if there's one, then De Saussure's point is clear, that there is only an arbitrary relationship between the signifier and the signified. And so, you might hear a pastor say, now the word church in Greek is ekklesia, which comes from ek, which means out of, and kaleo, which means called. So the church are those who are called out. Well, it's a nice sermon illustration, but I doubt very seriously that thought ever entered the Apostle Paul's mind, or the vast majority of Greek speakers in the ancient world. Now, sometimes that works, like in words that, exerchomai means to go out. That works much better. But like, take the English word understand. Nobody would say, well, when I understand something, I'm standing under it. You see what I'm saying? The history of a word or the parts of a word have no necessary relationship to what a word means, because the meaning of a word is in how it is used, period. There is no core meaning that carries around everywhere a word is used, including its past history. Now, sometimes context can bring that stuff in, but there's no necessary connection. By the same token, not only does a word not mean necessarily what it meant previously, but a word that we are reading from the past may not mean what it means now. I didn't put that very well. So like the word martyr in the New Testament does not mean martyr. It means witness, because the word martyr did not come to mean martyr until 100 years after the New Testament was written, or so. By the same token, the word for power in Greek, dunamis, did not mean dynamite. They had not discovered dynamite in the Near East. In Israel when that word was used. So fallacy of anachronism takes a meaning that it has now and infers that it meant that back then. Well, okay, this is a difficult thing. When we're reading various words, we have to know how it was used at the time it was spoken. Here's another fallacy where we assume if a word isn't used, then the concept isn't there. No, a concept can be present even if there's no specific word for that concept being present. Well, these word fallacies largely follow upon the insights of Wittgenstein on how language works. And as far as I can tell, there isn't any way to argue out of this. Wittgenstein's understanding of the meaning of language is more or less the way it happens. I can't think of any way around it. Okay, we've been talking about hermeneutics. Let me just draw some quick conclusions that apply to the Bible. So the words of the Bible had original meanings because Matthew, I'm going to say Matthew, let's say Paul. Paul wrote 1 Corinthians to Corinth. And so there were meanings, there were ranges of meanings to the Greek words that Paul used. So Paul didn't just make up words. Now there may be some places where you could argue that Paul made up a word. I don't think so, but there is a place where he makes up a word, kind of like one of my grandfathers used to call television. Well, he called it the boob tube, but some people called it hellivision because they thought television was evil. I don't know if my grandfather would have said the word hell, but so Paul does that with a word where he takes meat offered to a god and he makes it into a word, meat offered to an idol or food offered to an idol. I don't know whether Paul did that himself or whether Jews that he knew did it or Jews in his context did it. But what I'm getting at is there was a range of meanings that Greek words had, and Paul locked those meanings into a text called 1 Corinthians. The words of 1 Corinthians, they had a meaning, and it was a meaning in the first century. And the meaning of those words was a function. The meaning of all the words of the Bible was a function of the way words were used at the time the Bible was written. And those meanings related to the paradigms of that particular time. And those paradigms are frequently different from the paradigms of our times and places. I'm going to talk about paradigms in the next video on perspectives on science. But what I'm getting at here is that there was a original meaning to the biblical text, and that original meaning was a function of the way words were used 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. And those uses are not the same as the uses of English words today. Therefore, this goes back to what I was saying about Lectio Divina. You are not, by just reading the text and listening to it and letting it strike you however the Holy Spirit wants to strike you. Again, that's a fine practice, nothing wrong with it. But you simply will not arrive at what the Bible actually meant by doing that, unless you have those meanings in your dictionary already in some way. Okay, let me keep going. I know you're saying, is this video going to end? Well, I've got more stuff. I'm sorry. This is my favorite topic, speech act theory. So J.L. Austin was a British English philosopher who continued Wittgenstein's line of thought. I still think that Wittgenstein is the bomb and on this topic, and we can pretty much we get what we need to know from Wittgenstein. But J.L. Austin adds some stuff that is helpful. I think it's helpful, and some have really drawn upon Austin's work. And what Austin, and he's basically saying what Wittgenstein said in a more specified way. What Austin said is that words do things. There's a tendency for people to think that words simply inform us. So the people who think that the Bible is all about giving us doctrine don't realize that there's all kinds of literature in the Bible. So the Psalms are as much about expressing emotion as they are about teaching us stuff. When you read a psalm of lament, what's the proper response? Sadness. When you read an imprecatory psalm, which is where the psalmist indicts his enemies and asks the Lord to bring justice on them, one of the proper responses to that is anger. When Paul says, "These people that want you to get circumcised, I wish they would just cut their whole thing off." You know, he's angry when he writes that. It's not, okay, what can we learn from this verse? That's not the point. It's an emotive kind of expression. And so Austin, again, to me, I don't see how you can disagree with these things once you become reflective on them. You could be pre-reflective and disagree with them, but once you understand them, I just don't see how there's any way to argue with it. So like when a couple says, "I do," they're not simply, "I want to inform you of my intention to marry you." No, when you say "I do," that statement marries you. It does something. A promise does something, and so forth. And so words do things. They're not just informative. That's just a small part of what words do. And so Austin said words have a performative dimension. They do things. And he basically pointed out three different perspectives on a speech act. See, act, it's a performance. Speech is doing something. So the locutionary aspect of language, he said, is just, it's the content of what you're saying. The illocutionary aspect is what the author intends your words to say. And then the paralocutionary aspect is the effect that the words have. Now, unfortunately, as we know so often, your intended meaning and the meaning that people take from it may not be the same. I've preached a number of times in my life, and sometimes you'll preach and you'll be talking to someone after the sermon and they'll say, I really appreciated when you said this. That's very meaningful to me. And you're thinking to yourself, I didn't say that. You weren't listening well enough. I didn't mean that at all. But the effect and the intention are often not the same with words. And this is a good place for me to introduce another philosopher of language, Paul Ricoeur, who probably next to Wittgenstein is my most favorite philosopher of hermeneutics. Ricoeur taught at the University of Chicago for a number of years. But Ricoeur talks about what we might call the autonomous text. And that is that once a text has been uttered or written or whatever, once you have said something, you are no longer in control of it. It takes on, autonomous means it's self-ruling. And so when you say something, it's on its own. By the way, I just committed the etymological fallacy. See if you can figure out what I just did. But anyway, so you can't control what your words mean once they're uttered. And I don't know if you've ever felt like you can see your words coming out of your mouth and you're like, come back to me. But this is even worse on email, social media. This is why we have emojis, to try to help people know when you're being sarcastic. I had a misunderstanding on a text exchange with a family member not too long ago. I hope I corrected it quickly enough and the person understood that I didn't mean what they thought I meant. They'd said about 4 things, and I responded to one of them, and they thought I was responding to a different thing and took offense initially. But anyway, Paul Ricoeur, once a text is uttered, the author is no longer in control of what it means. And Ricoeur also talked about what he called the surplus of meaning. I used the word polyvalent a little bit earlier. Let me go ahead and get that word out there so you can see it. There we go. A text has multiple possible meanings. Every text pretty much does. It can be taken in more than one way. There is a surplus of meaning to a text that has been uttered. And so this is why we have ambiguity. This is ambiguity. This is why we have multiple interpretations. This is why we have misunderstanding, because words are susceptible to multiple meanings, multiple interpretations. Well, okay. I did want to talk to you again about, like, for example, there are actually different approaches to interpreting the Bible. And I've kind of been swimming around these, but I want to go ahead and get them out on the page here. So historically, well, let me say that since the Enlightenment, since the late 1800s, I'll say that, in the late 1800s and the bulk of the 20th century, at least the first half of the 20th century, the predominant way of interpreting the Bible was what we might call an author-centered approach, and what we might call the historical critical method or the historical cultural method. And the idea is that if we want to read the Bible, if we want to interpret the Bible, we should understand what the author was intending this text to mean. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the author around to interrogate. And so there have been some who've used a phrase like the intentional fallacy. The intentional fallacy is the idea that it's a fallacy to say a text can only mean what the author intended it to mean, and that we can't know what the author intended it to mean. I don't use the phrase intentional fallacy, although I do think that texts cannot be bound by what their authors meant them to say. I do agree with that, and I also agree that we only have partial access to what an author may have meant by a text. So we cannot read the mind of an author that's dead and that isn't in the room with us. And so we can only do our best to infer what the author meant by, and I would use the expression an implied author by the text. Now, we can second guess these things, like you may know Machiavelli's book, The Prince. The Prince basically comes off as a might makes right philosophy. But some have wondered whether Machiavelli really meant this. And so somebody could write something and they mean it completely satirically, and yet we take it literally. And so the more that we want to infer the intention of an author beyond what is actually said, the more iffy, ground we're on. However, after saying all that, I still think that the pursuit of what an author actually intended a text to mean is an important pursuit, not least because it keeps us from a complete free-for-all in what we make a text mean. There are, however, also text-centered approaches. These were especially in vogue in the 1980s and a little bit into the 1990s. I mentioned structuralism, which basically said, what is the meaning of this text within the langue of structures of the language at the time. There was something called narrative criticism that basically said, well, let's forget what an author intended this story to mean, and let's just interpret this story as a story with characters and events and settings and so forth. Rhetorical criticism tried to do that using features of rhetoric. Discourse analysis also tried to analyze a text scientifically, observing for changes in tense and things like that, changes of point of view. If you're acquainted with inductive Bible study at Asbury Seminary, it's very much a text-centered approach because Robert Traina and then David Bauer were very much in that era of biblical interpretation. However, I don't think that you can have a truly text-centered approach because context is everything. The meaning of a text is in its context. And so the text-centered approach is either going to favor a more author-centered context, or it's going to fall into what you're thinking. And so reader-centered approaches focus on me as a reader rather than on the text. And of course, ideological criticism may completely take the text however it wants to. You might have a feminist reading of the text, or a some other kind of reading of a text. You might have a Marxist reading of a text. And so this kind of approach privileges the reader's perspective over maybe the author's perspective. So there are some very critical readings of Paul from certain feminist perspectives. Not all feminist perspectives are critical of Paul, but there are feminist readings of Paul that are very critical of Paul, that are very reader-centered in the sense that they privilege the perspective of a particular group of people reading the biblical text. There's a sense in which denominations favor certain reader-centered approaches. They might deny it, but a Wesleyan might say, well, that's not the Wesleyan reading of this text. Well, who am I privileging when I say that? Well, I'm privileging me as a Wesleyan reader, or the Wesleyan readers as they read it. I'm going to make a claim now and say that a lot of theological interpretation right now, theological interpretation is very trendy right now. And I would describe theological interpretation as the interpretation of the biblical text with the assumption of orthodox theology. So I'm going to read the Trinity into Genesis 1:27, let us make humanity. And I'm going to read my sense of Christ as co-equal with God the Father when I read 1 Corinthians 15, talking about Jesus turning the kingdom over to God the Father, or when I read Colossians 1:15, that Jesus is the firstborn of all creation. And I read that in a certain way because I'm privileging orthodox theology in my theological interpretation. I would say this is a reader-centered approach. because it's basically saying that I, as an Orthodox reader, am the one who can determine, or orthodoxy can determine what the biblical text actually meant, rather than a more inductive approach that says, well, what did this actually mean within the worldview and paradigms of the original author? Of course, reader response criticism also led in the 90s to something called deconstruction. And the key figure here is Jacques Derrida, who is, of course, French. And he basically said texts don't have any meaning. A text is like a dog chasing its tail. You know, when I read a verse here and I go to the dictionary, what do I get? I get more words. Well, let's say I look up all the words I found in the definition in the dictionary. What do I get? I get more and more words. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life basically tracing the words around the dictionary, and I'm never going to get anywhere. Now, I'm probably not doing justice to Derrida, but my sense is this is funny, but it's not really very helpful, because for one, as Frege pointed out, sometimes words do have a reference, and secondly, as Wittgenstein points out, that reference is a language game, comes from a language game in a certain form of life. We don't just read the words in the abstract. We read the words in a form of life, and that brings them out of the misty clouds of nebulousness to actual meanings in particular contexts. Well, we're getting close to the end, I promise you. Hans-Georg Gadamer must be mentioned here. Gadamer lived in the post-World War II era in Germany, and he wrote about the two horizons of a text. And the two horizons were the horizon of the text and the horizon of the reader. Notice he doesn't put the author, he doesn't mention the horizon of the author. Why? Because the author's not here. To the extent that we meet the author of a text, we are meeting that author through the text, right? And so the text comes to us through layers of history. The author is we can never get to the author because the author is hidden behind layers of the text. And so Gadamer leaves us with, I think, an almost a very discouraging, I mean, don't get me wrong, a lot of people love Gadamer, but Gadamer leaves us a little, leaves me disheartened. I mean, in the end, it's just me and the text, and I can't really ever get to what it actually meant. I'm just a little bit more optimistic than Gadamer is. Maybe I'm self-deceived, but the theological interpretation that I just mentioned heavily privileges, basically, now not all, but there are some theological interpreters who would say that since I can't actually get back to the author, and since there's an ambiguity to the text, why shouldn't I just assume that the text was orthodox? I'll just assume orthodoxy when I read the text, because I don't have the author here to ask, right? And I can only meet the author through the text. And so why not assume that when the text is ambiguous, that it was actually orthodox? Well, I think that we can infer more about what the author thought the more we know about the context of a writing. Now, there's a lot of guesswork, yes, there's a lot of disagreement among scholars, and so fine. But Gadamer is often used as an excuse not to even try to find out what a text originally meant, from my perspective. And so I've not particularly found Gadamer particularly helpful in my approach, but he's all the bomb. I know that I'm the odd person out. I think history will come back. History will make a revitalization. People will get tired of Gadamer eventually, but we're still living in a Gadamer world. Living in a Gadamer world. Gadamer. Okay. Last slide. Metaphors. So language is not always literal, but hold on. I mentioned Paul Ricoeur. I like Paul Ricoeur's definition of a metaphor. A metaphor is a new semantic pertinence created by the juxtaposition of two unlike things. So if you go back to Aristotle, Aristotle tended to see metaphors as unnecessary, flowery stuff. My sense of Aristotle is just the facts, man. We don't need to have buttery images like the trees will clap their hands. Really? They're going to have hands? They're going to clap? Why even say that? Just say it's going to be great. Well, to say it's going to be great doesn't have the power of saying the trees will clap their hands and the rocks will cry out. You know, it's not, can you hear that? It's a rock, you know, it's not meant literally. It's a metaphor. And by the way, I'm using the word metaphor in a philosophical sense. In literary criticism, sometimes you distinguish between a simile and a metaphor, but in a philosophical sense, a simile is a type of metaphor. If you don't understand what I'm saying, just keep listening. Ricoeur pointed out, and he wrote a book called The Rule of Metaphor, that metaphors are new meanings. It's not just a flourish. It's not just, oh, there's a lovely flower on this word. But when we bring two things together and say this is like this, we are creating a new meaning. So, for example, we're very used to thinking of the cross as a sacrifice. When Jesus died on the cross, he offered a sacrifice. By the way, there are people who disagree with that metaphor even, but okay, I'll stop myself. But to say that Jesus' death on the cross is a sacrifice is not literal. A literal sacrifice involved taking an animal, slaughtering it, taking the blood, offering it to the god. You know what I mean? Dying on a cross is not a literal sacrifice. And so to call Jesus' death on the cross a sacrifice is to bring two unlike things together. I mean, they're also like things. So it's not that they're dissimilar. I mean, there has to be some similarity for you to bring the two things together, but they're not the same thing, cross and a sacrifice. And so by calling the cross a sacrifice, I create a new and rich meaning that wasn't there before, that wasn't there in simply talking about the cross. I have created a new meaning and a rich meaning by bringing together these two things that aren't the same. So metaphors are very powerful. Symbols are very powerful. Symbols are kind of like embodied metaphors, as it were. But so Aristotle's wrong, again, on this particular understanding of figurative language. Now, Lakoff and Johnson wrote a book called Metaphors We Live By. They've argued that that the origins of all language is metaphorical. That if we were to go back in time to the origins of language, we would find that the basic rudiments of language were based upon the world. That's a fun theory, but let me also make then the distinction between dead metaphors and live ones. So there are expressions that were metaphorical originally, but they're no longer metaphorical. We now use them in their normal sense is what they normally mean. So if something is figurative, it is not being used in its normal sense. If something's figurative, it's being used in a metaphorical way that is fresh enough for us to notice. So if I were to say this book is a fly swatter, that's not a dead metaphor. You heard it here first, folk. You know, and so you kind of laugh. Yeah, that is. I have some really big books that I call rat killers. You know, that's a figurative use of and a metaphorical reference that is living. But if we keep using metaphors over and over and over again, eventually they become dead metaphors in the sense that we don't realize they're metaphors anymore. They have become literal, I would say, or they've become the plain. Yeah, they've become literal. And so when I say that Jesus' death was a sacrifice, I don't know, is that dead? That's kind of a dead metaphor almost, because we talk about the sacrifice that Jesus made. You know, we say things like that, and it doesn't even occur to us that where was the sacrifice? He was killed a capital punishment. So Literal in this sense is when we take the words in their normal sense, taking the words in their normal sense. Metaphorical then is when we use them in an extended sense that compares them to something that is not, that's fairly fresh in our minds in terms of the comparison. We can also talk about the plain meaning of a text as opposed to what we might call figural interpretation. So there are metaphors in the Bible, right? The Lord is my shepherd. Well, that's the plain meaning of that text is a metaphor. Yahweh, God, is like a shepherd, but it's not literal. So not everything in the Bible is literal, but it is the plain meaning of that text. The plain meaning of Psalm 23 is metaphorical. Does that make sense? So when we talk about figural interpretation, that's where I'm taking the Bible in a metaphorical way, and it didn't intend to be taken in a metaphorical way, if that makes any sense. So there are places where, when Genesis 6:6 says that God was sorry that he'd created humanity, I take that in a figurative sense, because if God knows all things, then he can't be sorry because he knew it was going to happen. You know what I'm saying? I take that in a figurative sense, but probably the author of Genesis, let's say Moses, did not understand that figuratively. Moses probably actually thought that God, because Moses probably didn't know that God knew all things in the same way that later Christian thought would see him as knowing all things. And so the difference between the plain meaning of the text and a figural interpretation of the text is that a figural interpretation is taking the text figuratively when the text actually didn't intend to be figurative. And this is what the Protestant reformers like John Calvin and Martin Luther had a problem with the medieval Catholic figural interpretation. So there was a tendency to allegorize the text among some medieval Roman Catholic thinkers. And Calvin wanted to shut that down. Of course, the problem is that sometimes there are allegories in the text. The plain meaning of the text is allegorical sometimes, like in Galatians, where Paul makes an allegory of Sarah and Hagar. Okay, well, I think you've had enough, haven't you? We are done. This has been a download of most of my main thoughts on the philosophy of meaning, hermeneutics, and the philosophy of language.